I can see now the genius of bringing all of us here together, because usually it's so hard to try and capture the full complexity of the problem, the Einstein problem, and how amazing it is to stand up and have it so eloquently described as it has been this morning is fantastic. So yeah, I mean, if what are we? Are we the world's fifth richest still this week? If the world's fifth richest economy has a housing crisis, it's because it's a man-made housing crisis, right? It's not because housing is technologically too difficult a problem. It's certainly not because we don't have enough money, right? As we've talked about, housing is a wicked problem. It is this complex Gordian knot of competing interests, which are all individually understandable, but collectively are debilitating, and they're all just blaming each other. And we have to step back and try and do something about that, and to kind of to work out where. So how do we start to navigate it? Well, the problem is, of course, that as we've already heard, politicians aren't able to do the step back and think for 55 minutes bit, so they tend to leap to these oversimplistic things, still banging the same drums. And we're all so we tend to keep hearing the same simplistic solutions coming at us again and again. And we're all kind of familiar with most of them because we've all read the headlines. It's regulate the developers, deregulate the developers, do anything, subsidize the developers, please get on your knees and beg the developers. Blame immigrants, blame NIMBYs. Like every week a different headline. Usually what happens is politicians just do the thing where they put on a hard hat, promise to build more homes and hope no one asks how, right? And it's not because they're cynical people, it's because this is complex. And by the way, also things like just saying build more private rented, actually that's a symptom. It's not a solution. Even building more social rented housing, which we badly need to do, won't solve the market failure. So we all know this graph. So how do we begin to try and navigate our way through this? And particularly, I'm going to be looking at the supply side of the graph. So we all know this picture, which is the decline of housing supply, and particularly local councils building over the course of the 20th century, and with it, that rise of that massive inflation, which, as I say, is not just to do with supply and demand, as we heard. But the key point to take away from this graph, as Beth already mentioned, is that house builders have never, ever built enough homes. So the required amount is estimated something around £250,000. Even in boom times, they have never, ever built this. So that's a key thing. Like trying to get them to do it would be historically unprecedented. So perhaps a more interesting graph to look at is this one, which is not a blank page. This is a graph of who builds our homes in the UK. So along the x-axis, everyone who built a home in 2015, and along the y-axis, a pixel for every home that they built. So it's an incredibly sharp power law, long tail law. And in the UK, almost half the homes we build are built by just 10 companies. In fact, most of them are built by just 3. So we have this incredibly high concentration, and therefore, traditionally, there is this assumption since the Industrial Revolution that the only people who can build homes are these tiny number of huge professional developers. And down here, of course, you have this kind of long tail that's largely neglected. So there's this absolute understood norm that the only way of industrializing and building housing at scale is a small number of huge centralized players. And that's been true from cars to you name it. That's been the assumption of the 20th century. And it's worth rehearsing in our heads how that model works in development, even though we're all so familiar with it. So we take any given piece of land and we say, well, the land must be bought by a developer who borrows a huge amount of money speculatively, and let's say at this point, so we're going to stack up the costs per house here on the right-hand side. And ironically, the first thing they do is remove the people. And this should be the warning sign, right? We live in a democratic country, and yet our definition of development includes removing all the people before you do anything. So these are, in the literal sense, these are fundamentally undemocratic forms of development. It's a form of development which is done to, not done by people. And of course, then the developer hires one architect and one contractor with one chunk of money to build one whole neighborhood in one whole project. And of course, the law of architecture is form follows finance. So what you end up with is one big monolithic neighborhood. And that's why our cities look the way that they do. It's not an accident. And then, of course, they procure that entirely through the monetary economy with the skills that they have, and so our costs are mounting up on the right-hand side. I feel like Peter Snow doing the election now. The key thing is, and then, of course, on top of that, they have to pay back some affordable housing contribution, etc. And the important thing to understand is that what they're making here are not homes. They are property assets to sell. Right? They're not in the business of making homes, as Beth said. They're in the business of selling land for more than they bought it for. And so naturally, of course, if they stack up all those costs, but they can still only sell the property in that area for 250K, well, naturally what they're going to do is then reduce the quality of those homes, spend less money building so that they can still make their profit margin. They're not going to make their profit margin go down. Now, this does not make them bad people. This is their business model. And we're idiots if we expect them to do anything else. They're just serving diligently their shareholders. And so, of course, basically developers, they see everything that we see as good about homes, sustainability, quality, affordability, community engagement, as a cost. That's not because they're not greedy, that's just literally that's what it looks like on their balance sheet. And the result, of course, is that it's unaffordable to most people, especially when you factor in the level of debt and the interest on borrowing on that debt. The other killer, of course, these neighborhoods are failed neighborhoods, or future failed neighborhoods. What this model is doing is it's sucking money out of the real economy. These are not places where you start a business, right? These are consumer neighborhoods. They're best thought of as kind of permanent hotels for people with mortgages. Or if you're poor, it's just storage for humans. These are not real places. A neighborhood built by one person is not a place. And this is not a cartoon. This is literally what we're building. I mean, this looks like a communist country. This, of course, is Stratford in East London. And increasingly, as we've heard, it's in many parts of the UK, it's just not viable. On many sites, north of a certain line, they'll just say, sorry, it's not viable. So even for those companies, increasingly, this model is just not working. And so they will never, ever increase the amount that they build, as we already heard, right? They will simply say, like, you know, they have no incentive to build faster or to build enough or to build better quality. So they will always build about the same level. So the takeaway message has to be, not that we should stop that happening, they'll always be doing that, but there is a missing sector in UK housing, and it's not going to be them. So the question is, who is it going to be? Well, it could be the public sector, and it would be nice if a bit of it was the public sector, but let's be realistic, probably isn't going to happen. But we think, well, what if there's another sector that we've been ignoring, which is the citizen sector, which is people building homes for themselves. What if we could scale that up? What might that look like? So let's take the same house, so let's take the same site on the same piece of land, which, by the way, is just on the outskirts of London, indicatively. And this time we're going to, it's going to be purchased by a neighbourhood development company, maybe a CLT, or maybe a residents co-op, or maybe it could even be a vehicle created by the local authority themselves, which is what we see in many areas where this is happening. And instead of going through this rather, frankly, corrupted planning process, what the planners do is they basically create an LDO, a local development order. It's a set of rules and a design code. So they divide it up into plots, and each plot comes with a plot passport that tells you the planning rules that you've got to stay within. And they say, we don't want to hear from you. We can't deal with 100 planning applications, so as long as you stay within the rules, we don't want to hear from you. So much, much easier for local councils to keep control of. And then, of course, people are free to buy a plot, and they can custom build or self-build homes for themselves fitted to their needs. Now, the key thing about this is that straight away, there's no profit margin, no marketing costs to pay. So straight away, our house, the same house on the same land, costs less. But actually, of course, the person who's going to live there can also, for example, put in a bit of work for themselves, what's called sweat equity, so they can bring the price down even further. Or they could stage their project out over a period of years because they don't need all their house at once. So that might bring the price down even further. So it's not kind of a fake version of this kind of affordable. It's genuinely affordable, as in it costs less. You know, it's not debt. Most forms of affordability, which we talk about, are actually forms of debt. This is just costing less. And of course, the key thing is the homes are built by the people who are going to live there. You know, we all agree we need more sustainable housing. There is only one group of people who will ever have an incentive to put more insulation in the walls, and that's the people who are going to be paying the heating bills. That's the power of putting those people in charge of the housing procurement, because they see homes not just as property, not as property, but not just as property, but as place. The place where they're going to bring up their kids, and they're going to be living there 25 years. So any savings in energy, they're going to get back in heating bills. They see homes as infrastructure. Now, this is not a pipe dream. This is a model which is working in all kinds of places around the world. I was over with NAXPA a couple of weeks ago in Amsterdam, where there's amazing places that have been built using this model. In Germany, Baugruppen, groups of people who are coming together to buy a piece of land and build their own homes, kind of like 21st century, well, it's just co-housing, really. And it's working. And when you kind of compare these two development models, the costs are dramatic. And if you start, I won't go into the kind of lots of interesting things, but as soon as you could say things, well, let's look at things like CLTs or the idea for paying land bonds over 25 years, you can even take away the upfront land cost as well. So you could build a house, you could get a house for £75,000 anywhere in the UK. Even in London, that could be done by changing the model, by changing the way we're thinking about it. So what we're concluding so far is, I don't know how I'm doing on time, but what we're concluding so far is there is another housing economy, thank you, out there. It's affordable, it's viable, it's politically viable as well as economically viable. So why aren't we doing it? I mean, most of the political parties behind this, by the way, it's because we're all agreed it's too damn difficult. The transaction costs are too high, the overheads are too high, the communication costs are too high, the clients are inexpert. But the good news is, this is where I'm going to start bridging into the world of solutions, is that over the last 2 decades or two, we've seen digital technology transform our economy by activating long tails. This is what it's really, really good at. So we previously lived in a world where the only hotels were big chains. Today, the world's biggest hotel chain is Airbnb. So we know digital technology can help us deal with that too damn difficult problem. So I want to finish just by sticking my neck on the block and offering 5 quick-fire ideas for ways that we might try and solve the too damn difficult problem and make the citizen sector feel a little bit like what we could call a new normal in the UK. 1, measure it. At the moment, that graph, the statistics we have are only measuring 3 sectors. It's a very outdated way of thinking. As of 2017, we are lobbying that the government should be measuring the citizen sector, which is self-builders, custom builders, and community building companies, community-owned organizations, should be measured as a separate sector. We know that they produce something about 7 or 8% of supply, but if we don't measure it, we can't understand it, and we can't see policy impacts on it. 2, we need to tool it up. So these old, obsolete building technologies are not only rubbish from an environmental point of view, they're also way too difficult, big skills issues for most people to deal with. So this thing, what we call the 4th Industrial Revolution, the spread of digital fabrication, is really, really interesting to us. And that's really what the WikiHouse project is about. We're seeing the potential to put digital fabrication machines. Basically, we can develop digital technologies, building systems, which can be shared and developed as code. They can be manufactured not in a large factory, but in a small factory set up for about £20,000 using standard materials. Basically, it makes a massive, great IKEA kit, effectively. I'm not even going to wait for this video to do what it wants to do. This is a house that was built using the WikiHouse system. The interesting thing about it is that there are no professionals in the video. It's not even working, so it doesn't matter. There are no professionals in the video. It was built entirely by the farmer for themselves with their friends. But the house at the end of it is, incredibly high performance, kind of precision built house. So yeah, and so we're talking about suddenly putting the tools to build very high-performance houses for very low cost, very quickly, into the hands of almost any, literally into the hands of any citizen or business in the UK. And these technologies that we're developing are completely open source. You can go online, you can download this little micro house here as a starter for 10. You can build it for about £37,000. And it's a very high-performance little house. Completely open source. So we're trying to develop a new kind of commons for the whole industry. So nobody can say it's too difficult to build a good house. The next step is let's build a common supply chain. And I'm not going to talk too much about this, but at the moment, if you are a community business or a group of residents on an estate who want to have a kind of right to regenerate, if you like, or you're a self-builder, the process of going from here to there is colossal. It's terrifying. It's this big guesswork. That's why they make TV programs about it. That's why traditionally we just hand it over to developers and say, you deal with it. So what we're working on next is ways of digitizing this, trying to make the whole process on rails, making it simple for you to go through. The fourth one we're proposing is a new digital service. It's a myth that there is no land in the UK. Housing constitutes only 1.1% of the land area of the UK. In fact, half of the area that is taken up by golf courses. So there's a huge amount of land, including lots of microsites. So one of our collaborators demoed it. This is Birmingham. And they found, looking at the data, they found 14 hectares of tiny sites within central Birmingham that could be developed. But local authorities don't know how to bring those forward. So with the right to build obligations, local authorities now have a right. You can sign a register. And local authorities now have a right to find a way to get that land to you. Let's make it easier for them and easier for you by making a new digital public service called right2build.gov.uk, where you can go on, you can find sites, and they can list planning rules on those sites in one location. And finally, this is the controversial one. Stand by. Also, this is about the kind of myth of land. So this is a policy idea that we're kind of floating and seeing who likes it. It's called the right to replace. So let's take London. About 1/7 of London's housing stock looks something like this, quite old, quite dilapidated, ridiculously overpriced now because of the land values underneath them, semi-detached houses. Now, if you look at a semi-detached house, down the side, there's always this strip where the bins or the car goes. Now, if you total up all those strips, just in London, you end up with a borough, an area the size of Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Now, we already own that land. It's already in the M25. It's not in the Green Belt. We already have it. But we aren't able, it is we, the people, that give ourselves permission to create land. So what if we were to create a new thing called the right to replace? You can't see this, so I apologize. Terrible graphics. Which would basically give you a right, like you have general permitted development rights, a right to knock down your home, replace it with your dream eco-home on half the site, paid for by selling the other half of the site for another young family to build their home, doubling the density of the suburbs, unlocking huge amounts of CIL investment into new public infrastructure like schools and things like that. And it's just a permission basis. Here's the trick, though. You could only do it digitally. It works a bit like Tinder. You only get your right to replace if, say, 3 out of 4 of your neighbors also opt in to take their right to replace. Like, the answer is never less democracy, it's always more democracy, but smarter. So if you want to throw tomatoes, now's the time to do it. Finally, so what is the big picture? What's the big ambition? I think we have to take this seriously, and we can, right? The government has committed by 2020 to doubling the size of the citizen sector to something like 24,000 homes. And I believe if we do those sorts of policies, we could do it. And we're not on target at the moment, but we could. Actually, if we did all those things, I think we should be much, much more ambitious. Something like the right to replace could unlock 400,000 homes in London alone. So I think we should be targeting something like 2025. We should be targeting doubling it again to something like 50,000 homes. And at that point, we begin to get nearer that supply target of 250,000 homes. The final point I'll make, and then I'll shut up, I promise, is this, which is ultimately, it's not really about, as we heard earlier, it's not really about supply and demand. Just creating supply isn't the thing. But the moment you've made a true right to build, what you've created is another option. You can no longer be held as a captive. And effectively, it means that once you're in a country where anyone, anywhere, can, if they need to, buy a plot of land and build a home for themselves, then we won't have a housing crisis. Because what we've got to do is start to shift our attention from the idea of the housing crisis as this big debt problem waiting to be solved, to the idea, as John Turner said, as housing as a capacity, which is naturally there, just waiting to be unlocked. Thank you very much.